Hi everyone. This is the History of South Africa class at Flagler College. Today we're going to be talking about the 1994 election, and we'll start by discussing the few months leading up to that. This was a time of great excitement, but also a great deal of tension and even violence. And in some ways, the violence that had characterized South Africa over the previous few years was stepped up to an even greater level than it ever had been. And this was on full display for the international community, given that press restrictions had been lifted, and so some pretty grisly scenes accompanied this. One of them is actually pictured here on the slide, so I apologize if this is upsetting to seriously upsetting to anybody. But this is a pivotal time. The Constitution, or rather the Interim Constitution, which was written in the second half of 1993, did not meet with the approval of everyone, and it was kind of the usual suspects: those who had not participated in the constitutional negotiations, those who had boycotted the various conventions that were leading up to that, remained intransigent, and even some who had been part of those talks were upset by the result of it, and thought that certain guarantees should be made. This is especially the case for the homeland governments. Several of the homelands, especially Bophuthatswana and Transkei and Ciskei, had been, and Venda, those four, had been decreed as independent countries by the National Party government between the late 70s and early 1980s. And the leaders of at least a couple of those, Bophuthatswana and the Ciskei in particular, wanted guarantees that their independence, as they saw it, although that independence was really kind of a sham, this was only recognized by the National Party. They did not have any sort of international acknowledgement of their existence. No embassies abroad, no apparatus for trade negotiations with any other country, really no presence in the kind of foreign eyes at all, right? And they were seen by many, including most of the inhabitants of these homelands, as, I should say, the government officials were seen as puppets for the National Party and for apartheid itself. The ANC was tremendously popular in these homelands, with the exception of KwaZulu, which had not been decreed full independence. But in these other places, the ANC was by far the most popular political party. But these leaders who had been appointed by the National Party wanted to hold on to power as much as they could, and this is going to lead to some real ugliness and some real violence. The most intransigent, arguably, of all of the groups, because they had a real stake in this, and had they been involved, from the beginning, they probably could have secured for themselves a better position than they ultimately held, was the Inkatha Freedom Party. And we've talked about this a great deal already, but suffice it to say that in the weeks and months leading up to the 1994 election, Mangosuthu Buthelezi was the most reluctant and frankly stubborn of all of the political figures. Continued to insist that this whole thing was just in the control of the ANC, and that this was bad for South Africa and especially bad for the Zulus. Really, Inkatha's demands amounted to nothing less than an independent Zulu state under the monarchy of King Goodwill Zwelithini. And they even went so far as to say that the territory of KwaZulu ought to include all of the land that Shaka himself had conquered, 100 and almost 200 years before. Well, that was obviously unacceptable. I mean, that had not been a political reality, arguably even in Shaka's time, but for many, many, many decades, a century and a half or more. And so, this was a non-starter, right? But the IFP continued to hold out for these sorts of things. And eventually the ANC made some concessions, and the National Party held talks, and they gave a great deal of ground. But we'll pick that up in just a minute here. The Pan-African Congress and others like them, there were, sort of far left radical political parties among the black population continued to call for an armed struggle. They did not want to participate in elections because they felt that this would just be a perpetuation of white power. They felt that the ANC was selling out by negotiating with the whites, and they wanted the entirety of South Africa to be in black hands with no whites left, or with whites having no political rights. So the PAC continued to carry on an armed struggle, and perpetuated a great deal of violence, as did the IFP. The Azania People's Organization was another one, Azapo. So the PAC was not the only one, but it was one of a small group of these fringe political parties doing this. On the right, the so-called Volksfront, which was really what was left of the Conservative Party. This came to cohere around a former military general named Constant Viljoen. And it seems that Viljoen, he was working together with the Aviabia, this kind of neo-Nazi paramilitary organization that we talked about, and with some others, but they had plans to bring about a kind of coup, and to seize, with the cooperation of the military and the police and others, and to seize control of the Transvaal and the Free State, and to turn this into a homeland for white people, right? And this was something that the Aviabia had talked about for some time, and Viljoen, who was less extreme than Eugene Terreblanche and others of his ilk, was interested in this, and really stood at the head of this thing that was called the Volksfront. Though this is not a political party, this is kind of an umbrella term capturing all of these right-wing white groups in South Africa. In October of 1993, interestingly and somewhat ironically, the Volksfront and Viljoen himself entered into an alliance with the Inkatha Freedom Party and with Lucas Mangope and other leaders of the homelands to effectively do everything they could to stop the elections from taking place. And so, the violence that came from this, Viljoen and others were organizing armed troops to try to seize control of at least part of South Africa and establish a homeland for the Afrikaners. Of course, the Inkatha Freedom Party wanted the same thing for the Zulus. And they were calling for South Africa to be a loose confederation of mostly independent territories under the control of various ethnic groups, and especially whites and Zulus, right? Now, there were deadlines set to register parties to participate in the elections. The initial deadline, I believe, was March 4th of 1994, but over the course of March and April, these deadlines kept getting pushed back, because Mandela and de Klerk and others were desperately trying to bring these other parties to the table to have a legitimate election. This election, it became clear, was going to be marred by violence, but they wanted as many people as possible, as many parties as possible to take part in this, so that there would be an accurate measure of the voting public, right? So, they're sort of shifting between negotiations and continued violence. I should say that the ANC was not, or I should say supporters of the ANC were not squeaky clean in all of this. The conflict between, for instance, Inkatha Freedom Party hit squads and ANC self-defense squads continued. There were clashes between the ANC and PAC operatives. There were clashes between the ANC and various radical white organizations who were part of the Volksfront. And this violence was just constant. There were some blacks who perpetrated serious violence against whites. There was one instance where I believe it was in the Cape, where I think it was a PAC operative, but I'm not absolutely certain about that, opened fire into a white church ended up killing a dozen or more of the parishioners of that church and injuring many more. But much of the loss of life came at the hands of people like the Avi Abia, who just sort of carried out campaigns of terror and fired indiscriminately into crowds, and then of course the violence between ANC supporters and IFP supporters in the streets of the townships, and especially in the townships around Durban. Mandela, after the initial deadline passed at the beginning of March, Mandela tried desperately, and de Klerk as well. They met together with them. They met independently of each other with Buthelezi and with Goodwill Zwelithini. They offered, first of all, to combine KwaZulu with Natal, and to put a lot of the control in the hands of, not to be completely autonomous, but to put a lot of the regional control in the hands of the Zulu king. When that failed, they offered to make Goodwill Zwelithini the official constitutional monarch of KwaZulu-Natal, and to give him a hefty pension, or I should say a hefty stipend. At the last minute, they agreed to hand over a huge amount of territory to the direct control of Goodwill Zwelithini that would not have any government presence in it, or that he would be free to do what he wanted with it without the government exerting any kind of control. This was like 3 million acres of property or something like that, right? So they bolstered the position of the Zulu king. Buthelezi, in every one of these instances, with every offer, refused to be part of the elections, refused just flat out, and insisted that the only possible way that he would be interested is if KwaZulu was declared as an independent country, and that it would not be governed at all by South Africa, and particularly by the ANC. I should say that many people within KwaZulu-Natal supported the ANC, and that's why the worst violence was there, because even perhaps if the majority of Zulus supported the IFP, it was definitely not all of them. And so in townships like KwaMashu outside of Durban, it was just a great deal of violence between these two parties. A key moment that brought most of the parties finally to the table happened on March 11th, 1994. Constant Viljoen, after having repeated meetings with Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, and actually being assured during these meetings that Mandela, was not out to kill all of the white people, that this was not going to be genocide against the whites, that the ANC took over, Viljoen, on March 4th, on the deadline, decided to register a new party called the Freedom Front. But no candidates were put in or anything like that. He just created the party and registered it for the election, but there was really no organization. With the events of March 11th, though, this forced the Freedom Front finally to be fully committed to the election. Specifically, now, what was happening here? Remember the alliance between the Volksfront and the IFP and the leaders of these homelands. Lucas Mangope, the ruler of Bophuthatswana, was the most hard-headed, the most committed to the independence of his homeland of all of these homelands leaders, with of course the exception of Buthelezi. And Mangope really, because the ANC commanded the support of the vast majority of people in Bophuthatswana, Mandela was content just to sort of marginalize this guy. But Viljoen, seeing a possible opening where he could compromise the ANC, had collected a force of about 4,000 soldiers, with the intent of aligning these soldiers with those who were still loyal to Mangope, and sort of forcing the ANC to acknowledge the independence of Bophuthatswana, and then this would then follow with the independence of a Volksrepublic for Afrikaners. So that was kind of the goal here. He told Terre Blanche and the other members of the AWB not to get involved. But they learned about this plan, and rather than wait for Villon to direct the course of events, Terre Blanche gave orders to his AWB commandos to go into Bophuthatswana and to raise hell, right? So they drove in there. They started shooting randomly at people. Anyone they assumed was an ANC supporter, they shot at. They killed a number of people. But the soldiers of Bophuthatswana at that point, loyal, most of them loyal to the ANC, managed to kind of rout the AWB operatives. To call them operatives is actually kind of an insult to the word operatives. These are just thugs roaming around, committing indiscriminate violence. The most famous image is the one in the middle here, on the left hand side of the slide. There was a Mercedes-Benz with, I think, 4 of these AWB guys, and the soldiers surrounded this. They shot into the car. They killed 3 of them, and you can see, there are 2 guys in the back seat. One of them kind of halfway out. There's a guy on the ground who is dead. And then the driver pleaded for mercy, and with the television cameras rolling and broadcasting all over the world, the soldiers ended up killing this guy, executing him. And so this is a really ugly scene, but the embarrassment was for the whites, right? That this was an act of terrorism on their part. This is how it was perceived internationally and in South Africa, and that they were totally incompetent, moreover. And that any thought that the whites could muster enough support and enough organization to try to gain their own land militarily sort of went out the window with this embarrassing scene, right? With black soldiers easily defeating these AWB thugs. And so Villon, in embarrassment, withdrew or rather repudiated the AWB and began to register Freedom Front candidates for the election. And there was really no more violence from the right wing, apart from the AWB, who continued to do that. In fact, during the election, they were shooting indiscriminately at taxis in Johannesburg, carrying people to polling stations. They were trying to disrupt the election in a number of ways, and really they just did what they tended to do, which was make complete asses of themselves, though at the cost of some lives, of course. When negotiations finally failed entirely and broke down between the ANC and the National Party and the IFP, Mandela and de Klerk, and especially Mandela, because he, of course, had the greatest position of strength, decided just to let the AFP go, blow in the wind, so to speak, and not be part of the election, and then, with the new government would suppress the IFP terrorist activities with force if necessary, right? That was the new solution. Buthelezi, about a week before the election, called for an international commission to come in and broker a peace between the IFP. I mean, this is really in my mind, an extreme act of hubris. Like, he wanted Henry Kissinger to be the head of this whole thing. Like, we're going to call in an international group to come and work things out because the ANC just isn't playing fair. That was his line. When actually Kissinger and others showed up, Lord Carrington, who had been a former British foreign secretary, they all showed up, but realized that there was no common ground between the ANC and the IFP. Most of them turned around and left within a day or two. There was one member of the delegation. He was a Kenyan. I forget his name, but he had known Buthelezi for some time. He's the one who finally talked sense into him and said, look, if you don't agree to be part of the election, I mean, the IFP will have absolutely no leg to stand on in the new South Africa, no political power at all, and the Zulu will be beaten into submission. There will be continued violence. Your people are not going to survive this. And so Buthelezi finally agreed and registered for the election on the 19th of April, which was 8 days before actually 7 days. It started on the 26th, before the election was scheduled to begin. So finally, all the parties were in in the camp of the election. Even the PAC and other rather radical groups had joined at this point. Of course, the AWB didn't have any candidates, or I think the Azania People's Organization boycotted. But these are very marginal. No one took them terribly seriously. They actually had to put stickers on the bottom of the ballot with the IFP candidates because the ballots had already been printed. So they printed up a bunch of stickers, slapped them on there, and the IFP was at the very bottom. In the midst of all of these negotiations, all of this violence, the ANC ran a very skilled political campaign. They hired advisors of Bill Clinton, who had been part of his presidential campaign in 1992, including, I believe, the chairman of his entire campaign. Came in to advise and be a strategist for the ANC. The ANC political machine operated smoothly despite the inexperience that they had in actually campaigning for elections. Mandela himself was tireless at canvassing. He visited every part of South Africa. He met with people all over the country, drew huge crowds. Really, his face, more than almost anything else, was the factor in all of this. The elections themselves, by the opinion of international observers and even most people in South Africa, were peaceful. The AWB did, as I said, perpetrate some violence. There were still clashes at times in various townships, but it was almost entirely peaceful. There were some flaws and even some fraud. There was evidence that people voted multiple times in some places. There's evidence that in some polling stations, they didn't even really count the votes. They just determined that they just kind of made up numbers. But this was not terribly widespread. There were some pretty egregious examples of fraud, but this is not something that marred the entire election. And the results ended up coming out pretty much like the polls were indicating before the election. The place where the fraud probably happened the most was actually in KwaZulu-Natal, where the IFP ended up with a majority in the provincial election. They had about 50% of the vote. The ANC had 33%, something like that. And it was thought, or at least there were rumors, that the IFP and the ANC had more or less just negotiated what the final numbers would be, that this didn't necessarily reflect the votes, but it did reflect what polls had been indicating. And so it was seen by most as a pretty free and fair and legitimate election. The turnout was incredible. This is truly one of the great moments, I think, in all of the 20th century. These massive lines, as you see on the top picture on the slide here, these massive lines outside polling stations where people waited in some cases for like 10 or 12 hours to cast their vote, but they were willing to do this. About 90% of all registered voters ended up voting in the election, which is just an incredible number. And the results came back with the ANC capturing almost 63% of the vote. Not a super majority. They did not have a two-thirds in the parliament, but they did have a definite majority and a very strong position. The National Party polled very well at a little over 20%, including a majority in the Western Cape, which included Cape Town, partly because, if we go back to that last slide, actually, you can see that the colored population tended to support the National Party. This bottom picture shows a group of colored campaigners, supporting FW de Klerk. And so, the ANC won a significant majority, in some cases up to like 90% of the vote, in 7 of the new 9 provinces. But in KwaZulu-Natal, IFP won a slightly more than a majority, and in the Western Cape, the National Party won a slight majority. So the ANC did not have a run of the entire country. Because the National Party got a little more than 20% of the vote, they had the right to name a deputy president, as did the ANC. And so Mandela was elected as the first president of the Democratic South Africa. Thabo Mbeki as the first deputy minister, given that the ANC got 62% of the vote, and de Klerk as the second deputy minister. And Mandela formed what was called the Government of National Unity. He even included Buthelezi in his cabinet. There were 3 IFP members in the cabinet, 18 members of the ANC, 6 members of the National Party in a cabinet. So that's the entire, that's 27 members of the cabinet. Buthelezi was given the very prestigious portfolio of Home Affairs. This is one of the most powerful of all of the cabinet ministers, right? So this is a definite effort to appease him. And Mandela would continue in his presidency to cater to Buthelezi and try to win his loyalty. Now, they had, after all, been friends many years before. They had both been members of the ANC, both attended Fort Hare. They'd known each other for some time. And so, there was, even though there was a lot of bad blood between them, Mandela did his level best to try to win Buthelezi over, and to some extent, he really succeeded in that. The inauguration of Mandela in Pretoria on May 10th, 1994, was, again, one of the great moments in South African history, and I think in all of the history of the 20th century. His inauguration speech was short, but certainly did capture, I think, the moment. Let me just read. This is in the Klerk and Warger book, document 17. We understand still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Let each know that for each the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. God bless Africa. So that was the conclusion of his speech. And that really signals where Mandela's presidency would end up going, right? The goals that he had and tried to achieve during his 5 years as president are captured there, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture.